like 1 more minute and let people keep joining, and then I will get started on my scripted remarks that introduce the keynoters. Oh,
I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, but I am the designated tech person for the keynote. So if anybody has any issues, please feel free to DM me in the chat.
Mm-hmm. All right, I've put some information in the chat about some useful links and some instructions for participation. So please feel free to refer there. Can I just say I'm loving all of the conversation already happening in the chat. This is fabulous. Hi, Coda. All right, we are at 12:02, so I'm going to officially get us started. It's a little weird to start without all of the rustling of clothes and like zipping of bags and things. So take a minute and pretend like all the things happen that cue your brain into like, okay, conference space. My name is Kegel. I am the current president of the Association for Rhetoric of Science, Technology, and Medicine as of 5 days ago. I've been the first vice president, yay. Emily, who, if you are on the last couple of minutes, you heard from, Emily Winderman, is our tech support for this session. So if you have any issues, please do chat her directly. And Emily is our outgoing president. So I'm replacing her, a person who cannot be replaced. So thank you, Emily. Despite her official duties being over, she still volunteered to do tech support. So that's fabulous. So welcome, everybody, to the ARSTM at NCA 2020 Virtual Pre-Conference on Social Justice. If you see me glancing down, it's because I have my notes down here, and I want to make sure that I say everything that needs to be said. I am so excited to be here metaphorically with you all. I'm really missing seeing people and also the opportunity to meet new people this year. And so this is just delightful. And I'm so glad the enthusiasm and the commitment around this event have just been heartening and around this topic in the midst of an otherwise very difficult year. And I want to begin today by acknowledging the burdens that we all carry in this year and beyond, some of us more than others. And for me, that acknowledgement begins with acknowledging the colonial history that haunts both my geographic and my institutional location. So I'm currently in Lexington, Kentucky, on occupied land, as I'm guessing many of us are. Indigenous peoples have always lived on the land that is now called Kentucky, despite myths to the contrary, and continue to live here today. The place that we call Kentucky is primarily Shawnee, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Osage land. And the University of Kentucky, which is the institution that provides me with the material support that I needed to lead this pre-conference, it's their Zoom system that we're sort of all being filtered through right now. UK is one of the many land-grant universities in the US whose early finances were based on the dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And of course, just acknowledging these truths is not enough. I have a responsibility to do something about them now that I know about them, which is an early stage is an ongoing project for me. And I invite you all, and particularly my white colleagues, I invite you, if you haven't already, to learn about the colonialist histories of the places you are and the organizations that you work in. And a virtual event, you know, Les and I had, our keynote speaker, Les, and I had emailed a little bit about this question of land acknowledgements for virtual events. And the virtuality really brings the complexity of land acknowledgements to the fore. What is it that we're doing with them? The people assembled here today are spread all over, and everywhere we are, and everywhere that the servers that are connecting us are, I am certain I would bet you any kind of money there's a colonialist history of violence and dispossession there. And we could let virtual spaces disappear that history. We could let the virtuality be an excuse not to acknowledge it. But I know this is the right audience to offer this possibility to, which is allowing the materiality of virtuality to surface that history more clearly rather than disappear it. So if you'd like to learn more about the lands that you live on, check out the Native Land Map resource link in the chat. It's one of the links. In the chat, I've also linked this slide deck that you are all seeing right now with a welcome. And as you move through the slides, you'll see those links also available. So feel free to navigate over to that space throughout the day of the conference. It'll help you see what I'm doing and stay on track. I also want to acknowledge as we get started that while this is a scholarly conference, the topics that we're discussing, the oppressions, the resistance strategies, the racism, sexism, ableism, transmedia, fatmesia, and so on that we're discussing today are material embodied and experienced by real people, including members of our community. This year in particular, that looks like COVID ravaging Indigenous communities without any kind of proportionate medical or media attention. It looks like DACA recipients living with one eye on the news as the outgoing US administration repeatedly puts their rights on the line. It looks like more Black people murdered in the US by police because of anti-Black racism. It looks like Hong Kong protesters being jailed for any kind of protest, setting back their efforts to build democratic coalitions and support precarious South Asian workers. It looks like fat people being told that fatness, rather than anti-fat bias in the medical community, is the reason that they have bad COVID outcomes. And it looks like Americans' right to marry whom they want and control their own reproduction being at risk from an extremist judiciary. I could go on. It took me literally a minute to write that list, maybe. So again, I just want to remind us all, and particularly the privileged like myself, I'm very aware of who is implicated in that us. So some of us need reminding more than others that while we're academics, our work is not merely academic. What we do matters and can matter. And I'm really looking forward to thinking about how to matter alongside y'all. And to that end, I have assembled I need like a non-Marshall Avengers metaphor of keynote speakers to get us started thinking about this question of how our work matters, and also the broader theoretical and material context for it. We have this incredible lineup. We have Dr. Les Hutchinson Campos, Dr. Iris L. Davis, and Dr. Armand R. Town. So each speaker has prepared a 15-minute or so presentation for us, and I'll introduce them by bio and talk title before each presentation. Just a note on format. The keynote session runs until 1:30 Eastern, so we'll have about 25 or 30 minutes at the end for conversation and questions. And for the audience, I invite you all to participate using whatever modalities are most comfortable for you. So feel free to use the chat space throughout the presentations and after. You can drop questions in the chat at any point. If you want to make sure that I see them or Emily sees them in the chat, you might, even if you drop them at the beginning, like copy and paste so that you can drop it again when we get to Q&A at the end. I'll invite questions and thoughts after all of the speakers have completed their talks. And I'll also ask if folks, you'll be welcome to use the raise hand function and then actually speak on mic, but you don't have to use mic or video to participate. Chat is a perfectly acceptable modality. And if you are on video, you can wear sweatpants. I don't care. Yes, so let's jump in. I am thrilled to introduce our first keynote speaker, Dr. Les Hutchinson Campos. They're an assistant professor of English at Boise State University in the Technical Communication program. Les serves their program as the teaching assistant mentor, coordinator of curriculum, and the anti-racist student support consultant. Les's research connects cultural and digital rhetoric with technical communication and Indigenous studies, and they're primarily studying online safety practices by POC used within their community. They have published articles regarding medical rhetorics, privacy policies, doxing, online identity management, and storytelling. Les's talk is titled, Putting Ourselves into Our Practice, Indigenous Research Methodologies and Cultural Sustainability. And with that, I will pass you the mic, and Emily, I will pass you the screen.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Les Hutchinson Campos, as Kegel mentioned. I am Chicanx with Yaqui descendancy, and I was born and raised in the territories of the Serrano, Southern Paiute, and Mojave. My ancestors traveled to those lands from England, Germany, Italy, and were also displaced due to native removals throughout what is currently referred to as northern Mexico and Texas. I've engaged in community organizing in Kumeyaay land, as well as in Nequajon, where the rivers meet, land of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. I share space with you all today in gratitude for the Shoshone-Bannock tribes, the Kurleen, Kootenai, and Nez Perce, all of who continue to care for the land here in Boise, Idaho. I also acknowledge the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868 that formally distributed reservation land to the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. And my dog is chewing a ball currently, so you all get to hear gnashing of teeth and cats zooming around. So just gonna preface this talk with the possibility of many interruptions. My keynote today begins with a story. Where I come from and how I was raised, stories are an essential part of how we share knowledge with one another. Irregardless of, and are essential part of human history, irregardless of nationality, race, ethnicity, and experience. Stories, as Thomas King forever reminds us, is all that we are. But the story I share with you all today isn't exactly a simple one. I made a promise when I wrote the abstract of this keynote that I will offer practical strategies that you all can take with you to conduct more ethical and inclusive work that limits harm to people and our planet. I will be keeping my promise. However, I want to preface that the story I share with you all is going to require some effort on all y'all's parts. You'll see why in a few minutes. My story begins with a confession. I didn't always know I was Indigenous. Growing up, my mother always said we were Mexican and that was it. No details, no stories about where our family lived in Mexico and where they were now. All my brother and I knew was that on every holiday, my mother would confine herself to her room and cry about being all alone without any family. The irony of the two of us huddled together waiting for the storm to pass was not lost on me, even in the naivete of my youth. My mom has always been a strange person. Some of my fondest memories are when she'd take my brother and me into the hammock with her. She'd regale us of stories from her wild hippie days, when she saw Led Zeppelin in the first time they played in the US, or that time Jimi Hendrix hit on her while she was on acid. We loved these quiet moments of intimacy with her that were few and far between. She often worked long shifts at the hospital as a nurse, and we were used to fending for ourselves most of the time. I'm a little distracted by Julie's adorable child. It's perfectly fine. Love kids. And yet that was the thing. My mom taught me and my brother nearly everything we know about life and living. She's a healer. She taught us how to be good guests when over at our friends' houses and how to take care of company when hosting people at ours. She was adamant about us being polite and always, always, always leaving a place better than how we'd found it. My mom made an excellent nurse. She's as compassionate and empathetic as it gets. And she has a natural talent for taking care of others. Growing up, she always knew the exact way to cure whatever was causing me pain or making me ill. My mother had a magical sense of combining herbs, stuff from the yard or outside, and Western medicine. She'd regularly take us kids out to the desert to collect plants and other things for her tinctures. Though we never said the words Indigenous or Native American, my mother continues to carry the descendancy of Indigenous knowledge as who she is. The depth of her knowledge remains, up to this day, a mystery to me. Oh, am I moving the slides? There we go, sorry. That's my mom, by the way, on the right. And that's the desert where I come from. Emily, we're on slide 3 though. Thank you so much. One of our ventures into the desert, my mom and I were talking about something she had seen during a binge watch of a favorite TV show. We were casually talking about this story and finding something funny when we heard the distinct warning rattle of a rattlesnake in a nearby bush. My mom immediately motioned to me to stop and stay silent. Carefully, she crept towards the bush, reached down and snatched the rattlesnake and flung it up into the air, where she, with one hand, extracted the venom from the rattlesnake's fangs. Then she gently placed the snake back into the bush and turned to me to say we'd be safe around this particular area for the rest of the day. And off she walked, looking for just the right sage bush to gather for her bundles. Environmental biologist and SUNY distinguished teaching professor Robin Wall Kimmerer has a lovely testament of the significant relationship Indigenous peoples of the Americas have with the land in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teaching of Plants. For the beauty of her words, I'm going to read a passage from her chapter, The Council of Pecans. In the summer of 1895, the root cellars throughout Indian Territory were full of pecans, and so were the bellies of boys and squirrels. For people, the pulse of abundance felt like a gift, a profusion of food to be simply picked up from the ground. That is, if you got there before the squirrels. And if you didn't, at least there would be lots of squirrel stew that winter. The pecan groves give and give again. Such communal generosity might seem incompatible with the process of evolution, which involves the imperative of individual survival. But we make a grave mistake if we try to separate individual well-being from the health of the whole. The gift of abundance from pecans is also a gift to themselves. By sating squirrels and people, the trees are ensuring their own survival. The genes that translate to mass fruiting flow on evolutionary currents into the next generations, while those that lack the ability to participate will be eaten and reach an evolutionary dead end. Just so, people who know how to read the land for nuts and carry them home safely will survive the February blizzards and pass on that behavior to their progeny, not by genetic transmission, but by cultural practice. Kimmerer's explanation of the significance of mass fruiting pecan trees describes a necessary practice Indigenous people engage in as method for living, relationality. Relationality is an ontological understanding that the relationships we have with others, with the land, with all living beings do not merely shape reality, they are reality. In other words, relationality is the inherent understanding that everything in the entire universe lives in relation with one another. Everything is connected, and that we should act in accordance to this truth. I came to learn that I am Indigenous over several different moments of my life. One of these moments was when my mother was visiting Michigan in October of 2017. During an evening together, we sat on the couch. She watched one of her favorite TV programs. She's always watching TV. And I worked on finalizing a conference talk I was to give in the next couple days at the Feminisms and Rhetorics conference. As I was preparing my land acknowledgement, I turned to her and asked where our Mexican family was from and why we never spoke Spanish at home. Never turning her eyes off the television and without any change in her facial expression, she said to me plainly that our family originates in some part of Texas and that we never learned Spanish because our relatives only spoke their Indigenous language. I was surprised by this information and pressed her for more details, this being the first I had heard of our indigeneity in my then 36 years. She simply shrugged and said she didn't know and left the room to go to sleep. Next slide. During my doctoral education, I had a very specific and a unique kind of training in rhetorical theory, cultural rhetorics. My mentor, Malia Powell, created a graduate program that teaches graduate students cultural rhetorics, an approach to rhetoric that recognizes relationality as a methodological practice and operates under the maxim that all rhetoric is cultural and that all cultures are rhetorical. This means that everything we do creates meaning in the world and reflects our shared knowledges and cultures. As my academic sister, Andrea Riley Mukovitz, has said, a cultural rhetorics orientation is to enact a set of respectful and responsible practices to form and sustain relationships and cultural communities, and their shared beliefs and practices, including texts, materials, and ideas. For us, relationality guides us on how to build connection and community with others as a way of making knowledge together. Relationality, then, is at the heart of how we learn to do rhetoric. A common misnomer about cultural rhetorics is that we engage in rhetorical practices that go against the Western tradition of rhetoric. And while resistance is sometimes a way to engage in relational rhetorical practice, cultural rhetorics does not dismiss any form of knowledge in favor of another. Quite the opposite. A cultural rhetorics orientation accepts Western rhetorics as valid forms of meaning making, but it does something a little different. Just be like, I almost tried to touch the screen. That would not have been helpful. A cultural rhetorics orientation has 4 different methodological practices that work together to inform a researcher's approach to understanding how knowledges and meanings are made within different communities: story, relationality, constellation, and decolonization. Without being forthright and explicit, I am giving this talk using all 4 practices. I've shared some personal stories with you all to show you a look into how I've come to know the world through the teachings of my mother. I've explained how relationality works in practice and what it means when we adopt a relational worldview. Constellating, or the methodological practice of constellation, draws on Indigenous epistemologies by recognizing that all knowledges have value and make meaning in the world. To practice constellating is to put different knowledges together in a constellated web of relations to better understand how meanings shift across people and communities. And though the purpose of the talk here is not to describe and argue about decolonization, which if you want any of that, that's me on Twitter pretty much every day, I would like to make it clear that decolonization is not a noun, but an overall project that Indigenous people work toward. The goal of decolonization is land back and sovereignty for all peoples, living beings, the universe, and the land. Now, I'd like to return to that quote I blithely threw in by Thomas King earlier, the one about stories being all that we are. This is notably one of the more recognizable statements of people familiar with his writing. But I'd like to put this statement, stories being all that we are, in relation with something King says a little later in his book, The Truth About Stories. Thomas King questions whether Native stories should be written solely by Native writers for Native readers. He poses this in the form of a question and then discusses the importance of where stories are located, disciplinarily, to connect to rhetoric. He says, "So it's lucky for me that literary analysis is not about proof, only persuasion. In our cynical world where suspicion is a necessity, insisting that something is true is not nearly as powerful as suggesting that something might be true." Focusing on suspicion and suggestion, King shows that a truth about stories is that they invite critical inquiry about their purpose from their audience, whether readers are Native or not. King theorizes rhetoric as a way of seeing story as a form of truth creating and accountability that depends on interpretation. In this way, storytellers should consider their audience not only in the fashioning of their story to be persuasive, but in the ethical role they have in carrying that story's truth. And here is where I ask you all to do a little work too, as agents of knowledge making, relations each of you with all of us in an effort to collectively work towards cultural sustainability. I've come to define cultural sustainability as a necessary outcome of ethical research, but also in everyday living and communications. Cultural sustainability means all people have sovereignty, the agency to define their lives and live on their terms. Cultural sustainability means that we don't go into places and communities to extract information and knowledge, but we share our knowledges all together in constellated respect for the reality each creates and share what we make together for the betterment of all. Cultural sustainability is difficult. In fact, it's nearly impossible. It requires constant collaboration, communication, and a collective effort toward harm reduction at the cost of individual betterment and gain. Collaboration for cultural sustainability means upending how we've done work with communities, particularly Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx communities. It requires of us to not only look to people in these communities for direction and guidance, but to place them in the center of the work being done and a decentering of ourselves to a position in the constellation, in relation with these communities and the land. And here is where I follow through on my promise. The last descriptive slide I have for you all today is a set of 3 methodological tactics you can adopt right now, regardless of your rhetorical and professional training, that not only adopts a cultural rhetorics orientation to your work, but resists cultural appropriation and tokenization of Indigenous knowledge. The 3 suggestions I have here also have corresponding questions you can ask of yourselves as you're doing your work. If you'd like to have these questions for further use, please feel free to access a copy of my talk that I've shared with the conference organizers. The first one is, you must know your research story. Ask yourself, how did you get into this project? What are your motivations? What do you hope to get out of this project? Ask that truly and deeply of yourselves, and ask, why do you have these motivations and hopes? What gets you to this place? The second one is, learn the stories of the land you're on and those of the original inhabitants of the land. That also goes for not only the land that you're currently residing on, but where you're researching. And as Kegel reminded us in the opening to this keynote, of where all of our technologies and infrastructures impact the land. So you can ask yourself, what Indigenous people stewarded the land where you're living, researching? Are those the same places? Why not? What is the history of colonization on these lands? What stories do the Indigenous peoples of these lands tell about their people and the land? And lastly, number 3, to practice ethical research within a localized context. For that, you can do several things. Learn from how researchers have treated the communities in the land previously where you are. Try not to replicate those harms. Take them as truths. Spend all money locally in ways that support the local economy. I've learned this from Dr. Kana Ulok. I'm not going to even.
Ichikiyuak.
Ichikiyuak. Thank you so much, Keiko.
Mm-hmm.
She shared this with me in my class earlier this semester, so I'm very grateful for this knowledge. And last, share your research process and the outcomes with the local Indigenous people. Make sure you're not just writing a book to make some money, not that we academics make that much money off our books, but that the research that you create together impacts this community in ways that support them and their agency and sovereignty. These 3 practices are not a solution or a simple plug that you can adopt as an end toward ethical research. Instead, I want to affirm that these steps are a beginning. And in a true practice of relationality, a call on us all to seek ways to collaborate and build with one another, a research paradigm that sustains us all. This is only a start. We have work ahead. Shimegwech for your time, for listening, and for my esteemed co-keynote presenters.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hutchinson Campos. Feel free to do a little this or the reaction emojis, which I'm so glad Zoom has those available for us. We're gonna move to our second speaker, which is Dr. I'm looking for my part in my notes. Here we go. Dr. Iris L. Davis, or Dr. D, as I call her. Dr. D is a physician with over 30 years of experience as a physician and medical acupuncturist. She's board certified in internal medicine and integrative holistic medicine, as well as holds a fellowship in metabolic and nutritional medicine with the American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine. A graduate of the University of Virginia Medical School, she has worked and taught extensively in primary care medicine in the public and private sectors, with special interests in urban medical care, HIV/AIDS, geriatrics, and other areas. Her interests in healthcare access, cultural diversity, patient empowerment, and the impact of those issues in healthcare have been career-long. Dr. D's talk is titled Healing the Medical Dialectic. Please help me welcome Dr. D. We're very lucky to have her.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm so grateful to really be in this space and to share this opportunity with you, and I will try to restrain myself and behave at 15 minutes. But I want to really explain that what we're discussing is a history that existed before this country was formed. Because this is really healthcare. When you talk about healthcare, healthcare has this rhetorical view, or the rhetoric of healthcare has been, this is the best healthcare system in the world, because we have machines and certain things that in the allopathic tradition or the standard medical tradition can do so much for a unique and disease processes. And so in terms of some cures and then some treatments, there are some very unique things that the allopathic disease pattern can offer. However, when you really talk about our healthcare system, we often do not discuss the reality of the healthcare disparities that exist in our society. And they exist for the uninsured, the underinsured. They exist to a greater extent in all communities of non-European ancestry, whether we're talking, it'll be in this talk, it'll be predominantly African-American, but it also exists in the Latinx, all Native American and Indigenous populations, and in Asian populations. You know, there's this perception of the wealthy Asians that we see represented, but there's a whole different group of Asians that no one even begins to talk about that are not accessing healthcare in our system. So discussion of that dialectic, where you're not praising these remarkable inventions and, you know, really unique kind of entrepreneurs is difficult in this society. As it is rarely viewed from the full perspective of those who are adversely affected by the lack of their access to these systems. And it has been profoundly impacted by the way each one of the ethnic groups has a relationship to the greater society. So when we have this discussion, I'm hoping that we're going to be sharing, you know, a logical exchange of ideas and opinions. And for how many of you are aware of the national difference in death for COVID? Just give me a chat or a something. Okay, but most of you are aware, right? But are you aware that this has been an area of significant research in health research, in healthcare research, for over a decade, talking about the disparities? Do you know that 45% of all Americans of all ethnicities have a chronic illness? And it's 1.5 to 2 times higher for all ethnic minorities. So it's specifically for the African American, the Latin, and the Native American and Indigenous groups. So if you have that history already coming into an epidemic, you can imagine, therefore, that all of this could have been predicted, and in terms of our healthcare delivery and our healthcare response. So, you know, in fact, it is so critical that Andres Faya and Goldman are already describing the consequences of the COVID-19 epidemic as possibly increasing the difference between Black-white survival as a 39% increase. Now that increase in the differential, you know, this has been done basically for almost a century. When the United States started correlating death dates in like 1929. And so that the differential between Blacks and whites in terms of life years, et cetera, was about 13 years then. So do you understand that it only started going down in 2006, here it is 2020, and now we have this 39% increase once again. So, you know, that decline and that reverse will be significant. So I think it's crucial to recognize these components that all interlink and all tell their own stories. So it's not just that someone is an ethnic group and certain cultures within that ethnic group. There is no monolithic culture in any ethnic group in the United States. You know, all ethnicities have different cultures within them. And, but there's also this huge diversity within lower socioeconomic classes that's also not qualified or correlated. So let's put this give it some context in history. And the most important thing to recognize is that there has never been a significant ability to accept any efforts to make significant African American wealth. And that has been structurally changed in the United States. So that in terms of structural racism. So it's a key contributor to understanding how healthcare has been impactful in the African American community. Since the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 1968, there have been some strides in the community as well, and in educational gains and in employment opportunities. But you still have studies now that document that people who are doing the same professional jobs still have a pay disparity based on ethnicity, just like there is on gender. And so you still have a disparity in housing ownership among African Americans. It was 40% in 1968, and in 2020, it's 40%. You know, so I think that we have to remember that healthcare cannot be seen outside of the other structures of any society. You know, so we cannot separate the healthcare from the realities of the society it's based upon. So we can give stories, and the stories I brought to share with you actually came from my own practice. You know, next year will be the 40th year since I was an intern in New York City. And we went to the streets as interns and said, healthcare is a right, not a privilege. And so everyone's excited because there are new interns making a whole new Hippocratic oath. And what are they saying? They're saying the same thing. So in 40 years, that's how far we've progressed. That now there's more multi-ethnic groupings standing up to say that healthcare is a right and not a privilege. So, but as a Black physician, you know, patients often came to me, not because just of my capacity and my capability. Although I used to have, one of my favorite stories was the gentleman who came down from the Upper East Side and said, well, I figured for you to be here, I was at New York Hospital, which is Cornell Medical School. And he said, well, for you to be here and for you to have come from the institution, the University of Virginia that you came through, I knew you had to be smart. And it was just such a reverse use of the racial issues that I had fought through as an institution, you see. So there was a perception that if you were a Black provider, you had tenacity, you had knowledge, sometimes more than your counterpart, and you had compassion. So you got the people who came to you with chronic pain. You got the people who said, I can't get into my sickle cell clinic. And what am I going to do for chronic pain? Because the emergency room says I'm just a drug user. When that's one of the highest use or one of the highest groups with severe chronic pain that need ongoing and constant pain care. Unless they can have the bone marrow transfusion, which has only been done in the past year. You know, so you get those kind of stories over and over within various ethnic or lower socioeconomic communities. I have the wonderful history of having part of my family come out of the Appalachian and semi-rural tradition. And so you get this history of wherever there are health providers in shortage and in need, where people are coming to you with this need to, with this need to really state that they are human. And so this is really a concurring issue all throughout our system. You know, I just took my mother to a nephrologist, and here I am, I'm a physician. She knows I'm a physician. She knows my mother's an educator who's taught at very high levels and did everything from kindergarten to university levels. And she's discussing and telling us what not to eat. And when we said, you're not describing us, our personal culture, or the culture we live and eat in, she didn't stop in the least. So reporting her to her department meant that we had to leave that system and find another kidney specialist in another system. Now I had that autonomy, but my mother was hurt and she didn't feel like going. And I can't even imagine, can you imagine if you're on Medicaid and you don't know how to do this, you don't know how to navigate, and you don't know how to deal with all of this? So I'm just saying that we have these constant issues that allow all of us to grow, to recognize how we all have our own stories. So, well, where's all this bias come from? You know, where does it begin? It begins in the way that we all begin to train one another. You know, the providers that are present in our country, it has been since the 1970s, the United States, the American Medical Association of Medical Schools has been having diversity be an issue. So 56% of all physicians in this country are of European ancestry or white, 17% are Asian, and for Indigenous, Latin, you know, Latinx or African American 5%, Latinx 6%, Indigenous 1%. So the only group that has changed is for Asians. And it has not changed in the group that are most concurrently related with low-income Asians. So I think that that is a very key finding within our system and how our system responds, no matter what our systematic view of how to educate and bring people forward. Why is that important? I mean, if you're a physician, you went there to take care of people, right? Well, I think that it's important to remember that the looks at implicit bias and research that secondarily looks at implicit bias, which is the bias that you don't think about, you don't think of concretely, you don't go around saying, oh, I'm not going to treat that Black person, but you actually look at the behaviors of physicians, have been over 10 to 20 years at this point in time, and they're consistent. They haven't changed. The level of implicit bias in our society has not changed. It needs to be seen. Has it changed from the 1950s? Sure, it's changed from the 1950s, but has it changed within this period of accelerated growth that we have? Not significantly. Not in terms of the fact that African, you know, when we look at studies now and we look at how, if someone is in ethnic concordance, you're with a provider that is of your ethnicity or knows of your ethnicity, their culture, et cetera. But if you look at just ethnic concordance, Black patients with Black physicians, that might cause a 19% decrease because those physicians write more detailed notes. They write a better treatment plan. They have a higher rate of immunization in the same community. So this is what we reflect in our work. There are studies every day. Like there was just another study that came out of New Mexico. All pregnant women are supposed to get a tetanus vaccination prior to birth. So once again, it was like this big nationwide thing. Oh, these poor women didn't get any. It's standard. It's the standard by which American medicine functions. And that's what is important for us to know, is what is the standard so that we can change the standard. We can measure the standard. So, if you look at that issue and recognize, therefore, that most ethnic minorities, but certainly African Americans, have a higher rate of treatable disease. We're talking heart rate, we're talking hypertension, we're talking cancer, we're talking asthma, we're talking about a higher rate of environmental exposure in lower socioeconomic communities. We're talking about considerable things that have to be carefully extrapolated out to begin to look at the issues of underlying trust. So once again, that ethnic concordance, that ability of physicians to state and be able to take better care of people that they obviously see as human, whether it's pain control, whether it's appropriate hypertensive medication, whether it's nutritional counseling, et cetera, is an ongoing issue that has constantly been existing in American medicine. And much of it is due to the history. People are aware and have passed down from generation to generation. They may not know the specifics, but they know that there is a centuries-old mistrust of the system of care in our country. When medical schools needed, like I went to the University of Virginia, Jefferson had an entire building in the back for Black bodies to be used for the medical students. But other places didn't do that. They'd hire somebody and they'd go dig up people after they've been buried, and they take them. And almost all medical schools, especially in anywhere from the Midwest through the East, use that system to obtain history. People are aware of the Tuskegee, supposedly Tuskegee, which is a public health service in which people were not given treatment for syphilis, even though penicillin became available. People are aware that the father of gynecologic surgery, James Marion Simpson in the United States, he did testing for vesicovaginal fistula, which is a terrible result from childbirth, where you now urinate, you can't, you have this open hole between various organs, and you're just not in control of your urine, etc. But it's extraordinarily painful, and so he purchased slave women, and he would put them in surgery with no anesthesia. Now, he did give some of the Irish women. The Irish women were also not considered white at that time, but he did give some of them anesthesia. But I'm just giving you some idea of how this process of how people in lower socioeconomic groups and certain racial groups have consistently never been given what they needed. So it's very important to recognize how that becomes translated, as Les was saying, as the story that gets handed down from generation to generation. So, and studies as of last month, last year, and the year before are still documenting that no matter and that's the important part of the studies, is that they are documenting in full that no matter your socioeconomic level as a person of color, or you still will not receive what whites receive with the same diagnoses and at the same level of care. So that ethnic concordance is actually more higher sought. There's actually greater death, maternal and children, in very high achieving Black women, for example, in maternal data. It's just quite fascinating how that is. So that whole discrimination, we'll use this generic term of structural racism, whether it's healthcare, housing, education, criminal justice, finance. These are longstanding issues well over centuries long, since the Civil War. And so, we have to know, how do we go forward from this viewpoint? And so, you have to remember that African Americans and every group, that's why there's Jewish hospitals in Denver for the tuberculosis sufferers from New York. That's why there's certain medical institutions that were built by every different ethnic group. Or that's why there's been a continuation of the ethnic knowledge of what we call folk remedies or traditional healing or folk healing, etc. Because people always try to do something. So like by the 1890s, the few Black physicians that had been allowed to go to medical school started gathering, and eventually there were 124 African-American hospitals in 23 states and throughout the United States. This is not a Southeastern phenomenon. This is an American phenomenon. Only 2 of those hospitals survived after the institution of Medicare and Medicaid, which is when integration actually came at the same time. And so supposedly people who were brought into that system. So I'm not really describing a prejudice at an individual level, but rather a system-wide issue of racial attitudes and discrimination that always continue to impact the reality of care. So one other part I wish to add to that is that only now has there been scientific evidence when, like for example, there's a journal known as Psychoneuroimmunology, which actually started measuring some of the criteria that we look at for chronic inflammation and recognize that African Americans who are paired with white Americans in a certain study of the same socioeconomic level still show much more chronic inflammatory markers. And they finally stated that race was the issue. It wasn't that their disease processes were not controlled. And so, in fact, that was really supported by what is now known as the weathering hypothesis by Geronimus. And Geronimus as well concluded that racism and the burden of coping with it across the lifespan leads to differences in health among African Americans versus white Americans, including the onset of chronic illness and premature death, which is seen consistently no matter the socioeconomic status of African Americans. So there are other studies, we're not even going to talk about, I can't even go into all the various groups, but these studies are important to recognize because this is a pattern that actually documents what that kind of chronic ongoing process does in one group and certainly may possibly be doing in other groups. So policies to decrease racial discrimination certainly may be legal, they may be the law, but they have not changed the profound level of segregation in the society insofar as medical care is concerned. And that impact of that final health and wealth on the systems that African Americans, other minority populations can access are very different from those that can be seen in other groups. Pre-COVID, I would like you to note also that the USA already had almost 46% of the population was either underinsured. That means people have an insurance, but they can't afford their copays. They can't afford their medicine. You've heard about the diabetics who are dying because they can't afford their insulin. That's a real possibility. So, and they can't afford to go to physicians for ongoing care. So between the underinsured and the uninsured, that's about 46% of the country. So there needs to be a move in the perception and the knowledge base of the facts that are on the ground. The United States funds more than any other high resource country in the world per person, about $11,000 per person. The only country that even gets close to us is Switzerland. They're less than 8,000. And most of the other high resource countries spend about $5,500 per person. So, we have higher procedure prices, we have higher pharmacy prices, and we have much higher administrative costs, about 4 times that of anyone else. And so, I think that with those kind of realities, when you look at the facts, it's important to remember that we have possibilities for change here that we can impact, and we can especially impact it by the rhetoric by which we describe, interact with, and define. How many of you know how many people have been furloughed from your institutions? And they're probably in the $20,000 to the $40,000 salary range. The part-time instructors, the groundskeepers, etc. And how many of those people have lost their insurance, have gone from insured to non-insured? When you look in terms of African Americans, at least, and in Latinx communities, often we work those frontline jobs. And so that context can easily be seen probably within your own institutions, since you come from quite a wide variety of institutions. And those policies especially when there's a furlough so that people can't get unemployment, do not allow for them to continue their insurance, which is extraordinarily expensive. And the last piece I want to give you is that if you live in the southeastern United States or and I'm not doing this to be political, I'm just talking about where there is no Medicaid. Medicaid, about 46% of all Americans depend on Medicaid for medical coverage. But 58% of all African Americans live in the United States in the southeastern part of the country. And those are the states that refuse Medicaid inclusion without very gross, like you have to work a job and you have to do this and you have to do that. There's all these discriminatory kind of things saying you have to do this, you're not worthy of health care unless we can prove that you're poor, but you have done sufficient jumping through the hoops. I think that these kind of really arbitrary policies and the fact that we have such a scattered, diffuse system really biases everyone to recognize how fortunate we are for those of us who do have healthcare, and then how fortunate we are if we have healthcare that we can afford. So I hope to have left you with a sense of how important it is in your area to really just understand the organization of the systems in the United States, and remember that that slogan is something that you can begin to change and spread as you describe the present status of healthcare in the United States. Thank you.
Yes, please, all of the plaudits for Dr. D. I think that message is so important about the need to really understand the systems, and that's something we'll dig into in the Q&A, I'm sure, and also during our paper discussion sessions where we sort of work our way through domains of power. We'll turn to our final keynote speaker now, Dr. Armand R. Towns. Armand is an assistant professor in the Department of Rhetoric and Communication Studies at the University of Richmond. He's increasingly interested in Western man's overrepresentation as the human in both science and philosophy, and alternative genres of the human outside Western man's vantage point. This leads Dr. Towns to ask questions about race, gender, sexuality, class, time, and space. Armand's talk is titled Toward an Intercommunal Theory of Technology. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Towns.
Thank you for that introduction. I started with the goal of presenting one thing for this keynote panel, but you'll have to forgive me because I changed my topic after talking to my co-presenters, both of whom touched on questions of rhetoric, medicine, and technology. So after we met a few weeks ago, I felt that maybe I could touch more explicitly on technology in my own way. In particular, I'm more interested today in thinking about the relationship between the long Black freedom struggle and technologies. Scholars like Ruha Benjamin and Simone Brown continue this legacy, but I argue that such work has earlier roots, such as in the work of an underthought group in contemporary discussions of media, technology, rhetoric, and medicine, and that is the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, the Black radical organization of the mid-20th century that engaged in everything from the institution of free health clinics and free ambulances in Black communities, to monitoring police to stop police brutality in those same Black communities. More specifically, I will argue that the party's final political ideology, intercommunalism, was an underexamined philosophy of technology, one influenced by an unlikely academic source, the mid-20th century Canadian philosopher and professor of rhetoric, media, and communication studies, Marshall McLuhan. In a hall packed with college students, professors, staff, and locals at Boston College in 1971, Huey P. Newton, the founder of the Oakland-based Black Panther Party, outlined his thesis of contemporary capitalism, which merged well with the discussion of technology. That night, he argued that the United States version of capitalism was in the midst of a transformation from industrialism to consumerism, where new free markets were sought outside the US in second and third worlds. For Newton, the shift in capitalism signified the death of the US as a nation and the birth of it as an empire, different from previous empires. Unlike old models of imperialism, the US sought not to be an empire that coexisted with other empires, but to be the empire to which all of the world was subjected, often via capitalistic and technological linkages. At the height of the party's popular image as Black militants, Newton's goal in Boston was to illustrate that the party had also a highly theoretical platform. Prior to this time, the party had been framed in television, radio, and news as angry Black militants with little to no intellectual structure. This popular image coincided with massive violent state repression in the 1960s. Now Newton sought to illustrate how the party developed its political foundation so as to ease state repression. Further, he sought to position himself as the intellectual of the party, one conversant in third world and Black radical thought, and I argue philosophies of technology. Much of the contemporary work on the party interrogates this critique of imperialism and its development of solidarity with US Black people and third world radicals. Yet we should also ask what mediated the context in which US Black people came to view their own anti-racist struggle as consistent with the contemporary politics of colonialism in the US and also third world decolonial projects outside of the US. That night in Boston, Newton provided the answer to this question, an answer that remains largely unthought in his legacy. For him, advanced electronic technologies transmitted the struggles of US Black populations to third world populations and vice versa. These transmissions were not merely metaphorical. Newton argued that a new form of solidarity between US Black radicals and the third world was an unintended result of the US's own technological arrogance, which he referred to as intercommunalism. Newton developed a largely underexamined philosophy of technology, one that can be gleaned from his summary of the party's transformations. In the Boston College speech in 1971, Newton dialectically summarized for the audience the 4 stages that the party had undergone before it came to its realization of the importance of technology in US imperialism. In 1966, the party started as Black nationalists. Later, in their critique of nationalism, the party shifted to what they called revolutionary nationalism, in line with what Kwame Ture and Che Guevara called internal colonialism. The party's 3rd stage came as they realized that they were not nationalists at all, and they decided to call themselves Black internationalists. There was one final contradiction that existed even in this shift of the party to internationalism. On that night in Boston, Newton revealed to the audience that, quote, our mistake was to assume that the conditions under which people became nations in the past still existed today, unquote. Newton claimed that the previous nations were structured off of natural partitions, such as water or mountains, alongside violent colonial conquest. At this time, new technologies like gunpowder, mapping, and ships were expanding Western European nations, furthering the phenomenon that we know as colonialism. But Newton argued that even these conditions of colonialism were dying, or at least almost dead. At Boston College, he announced that the final stage of the party, based on changing technological interests of the empire, would be intercommunalism. Indeed, this final stage of the party involved 2 related parts. First, the largely white male reactionary intercommunalists who sought to profit from what Newton saw as a new technological and transnational form of capitalism. Second was the revolutionary intercommunalists, were those who could use the reactionaries' technologies to criticize their reactionary politics, which would be the decolonial and the colonial peoples in line with the Black Panther Party. Newton argued that technologically savvy white wealthy men were behind rising reactionary electronic technological changes, and the party would have to focus on this if they wanted to keep alive with the changes of capitalism. Electronic and digital technologies then were creating a new world that Newton attempted to understand, one no less racist or capitalist, but mediated in different ways. Further that night in Boston, Newton provided a glimpse into what constituted an intercommunal technological landscape. In true Marxist fashion, intercommunalism was a new order not concerned with the commodity per se, but concerned with surplus value produced via the situation of capitalism over nationalism. Interestingly, Newton stated that via the US's new technologically expansive domination, the reactionary intercommunalists created a global village, a space mediated by technologies of capitalism, or rather for capitalism's interests rather than nationalism's interests. Of course, not long before Newton's speech, Marshall McLuhan argued that electronic media, such as radios, televisions, computers, and telephones, had turned the world into a global village by the 20th century. According to McLuhan's 1962 book, The Gutenberg Galaxy, the global village ensured that nations would come to matter far less as the world's people would come to be intimately and sensorially involved in each other's lives. While McLuhan argued that older mechanical media like Gutenberg's Galaxy, or rather Gutenberg's printing press, were extensions of one sense, such as the eye, he argued that electronic media like television produced, quote, an extension of our nervous systems, unquote. Electronic media created a new world of increased sensorial involvement, information circulation, and interconnection. And people from different parts of the world can now be wholly involved and participate with one another, making nations irrelevant. In overly simplistic fashion, McLuhan also hoped that the global village would be a place where racism completely diminished, altering, quote, the position of the Negroes so that they can no longer be contained in the political sense of limited association. They are now involved in our lives as we in theirs, thanks to the electronic media, unquote. Yet I have to imagine that Huey Newton's recasting of the global village, in that recasting, he might ask McLuhan, when exactly was the Negro not involved in our lives? In fact, Newton foresaw my question: who are the our and us assumed in dominant philosophies of technology? Despite McLuhan's hope that the global village would diminish racism, Newton illustrated that when technologies are thought apart from the race implications of the human, it is an error symptomatic of Western racial violence. In other words, reactionary intercommunalism is McLuhan's global village. Revolutionary intercommunalism was Newton's. Neither McLuhan nor Newton's global village eradicated discrimination fully. In fact, the hierarchies worthy of challenging for Newton were often limited to race, colonialism, and class, with little emphasis on patriarchy, gender, and sexuality. However, Newton does point toward a critique of technology unthought in the work of McLuhan and useful for my own. McLuhan's frame of the global village assumed one human representative of our lives, which he called Western man. For Newton, McLuhan's white global village was symptomatic of the new human, one that he called a technocrat, who, like the new electronic media that was created, was not bound to one nation, but wholly capable of the transnationalization of markets everywhere, from the colonies to the ghettos. Newton's entire project was to shock this new human, to expose to oppressed people of the world that what McLuhan called Western man would now enter into the lives not solely by violent force, but also by marketing commodities to those who were once viewed as commodities themselves. Indeed, in the middle of the Cold War, fearing the influence of Russian communism on Black political organizing, both at home and abroad, the US opened up the market as the basis for liberal democratic practice. Democracy was not going to be based on distribution of equal protection of people under the law for the US, but on the equal capacity to buy, regardless of the nation one hailed from. But that was not all. Newton pushed even further than McLuhan could have ever imagined. While McLuhan imagined that the global village may diminish racism, Newton argued that the global village could be implemented both for racist capitalist purposes and to establish camaraderie between the US ghettos and those fighting colonialism at home and abroad. Racism would not end with the magical waving of the electric wand. Instead, it would end via electronic formation, or rather transformation, of connections between seemingly separate geographically, politically, groups of people. Newton argued that the global village created the new potential for revolution against a small, white, rich group of men who deemed the global village necessary to consolidate their non-nationalist market power. A consequence of Western technological arrogance, Black people in the US were no longer a minority, but a village, a global majority, or a multitude, as Michael Hart and Antonio Negri would later argue, mediated by the technologies of intercommunalism. We should leave behind the lack of critical examination of patriarchy, gender, and sexuality with Newton. What we can take from the party and Newton is a healthy skepticism of any guarantee of revolutionary potential in technologies. Newton thought that revolution was possible precisely because the reactionary intercommunalists were in the midst of some of their biggest innovations. There was no guarantee that the reactionaries could be fully stopped. Yet in their arrogance, the reactionaries potentially opened up solidarities between Vietnam, Algeria, and the US Black ghetto, turning them into a collective front that may end imperialism. In an increasingly web-mediated society, we would do well to remember the lack of guarantees in technologies that Newton forefronts in intercommunalism, a lack of guarantees that sounds similar to what Stuart Hall talked about. Newton suggested that technology, and particularly those aligned with the global village, could be revolutionary in the same way that some people, like my own brother, argue YouTube is today. But Newton also thought that the revolutionary potential lay not in increased representations of Black people on the screens or the airways, but in the increased communicative capacities that are left unintentionally open by the reactionary intercommunalists. Were Newton still alive today, his critique of capitalism may have led him to see something that he had predicted with reactionary intercommunalism. Long before today's widespread commercialization of the web, for a large portion of Black and brown people in the US critical of transnational capitalist markets, there's a disproportionate requirement to engage in the same process of transnational capitalism that's under critique. Rather than an ability to raise the consciousness of the people via screening films like the Battle of Algiers, or producing a newspaper like the Black Panther Party, or establishing Black studies, all things that the party was involved in. The web today is largely a world of likes, shares, and ads that can spread information that may be radical while also making excessive profits off of those who do not care about radical politics at all. I like to add that Marx is one of the biggest sellers on Amazon right now. In other words, radical politics are now presented as just information circulated within alongside other forms of politics. We may then be dealing with the full maturation of the reactionary intercommunalists that Newton predicted in the early 1970s, fully materialized via the web. The party engaged in a new media economy in which global concerns became local concerns and vice versa. The party was not alone in this. Like multiple US radical groups and decolonial projects throughout the world in the mid-20th century, the party was able to articulate US-based forms of oppression to Western imperialistic approaches to Black and brown people throughout the world. However, I add that the party was able to do so while cognizant of the technological implications of that oppression. And that is an area that I believe has largely been overlooked in studies of the Black Panther Party. So thank you for your time. I look forward to all your conversation.
Yes, all of the claps, all of the everything. For Armand and for all of our panelists. Oh, I have to take it back to gallery view because otherwise it feels like I'm just staring at you, Armand, which is weird. Yes, oh my God, I knew what was coming, and yet I'm still sitting here feeling just like flattened by insights and thoughts and questions. So I am really excited to turn to our discussion / Q&A so we can spend more time with all of these keynoters' work, draw some connections across these talks. As Armand mentioned, the four of us met a couple of weeks ago just to have a chance to establish some, I'm trying to think of like a good Silicon Valley, some synergies. And so I know that there's plenty to say, and our panelists have plenty to say. As a reminder for the audience, you're welcome to participate using whatever modalities are most comfortable for you. So feel free to use the chat space and say, you know, Kegel, can you ask this question? And we'll read it out. You can also use the raise hand function, which is accessible through the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Emily and I will keep an eye on those hand raises, and we can call on people to speak on mic. Do not feel obligated to turn on your camera if you do speak on mic. You're welcome to either way. If for some reason I don't see your question or hand, feel free to ping Emily directly in the chat. So she's our tech person and our former ARSTM president. Okay, so I'm gonna shut up. We have 20 minutes. Questions, comments, please. I want to make sure I'm not seeing any hand raises. I'm happy to jump in and get us started. So I keep thinking about that quotation, Les, that you shared, and then it was in my head then as Dr. D and Armand were speaking about relationality. So I'm going to read the quotation again because I wrote it down. Relationality is an understanding that the relationships we have with everything in the universe does not merely shape reality, they are reality. And so I was thinking about that, I mean, ontological claim in relation to what Dr. D was telling us about the need to understand the kind of deep histories and structures, and what Armand was telling us about, like, the difference between technology as you know, representational capacity versus technology as communicative capacity. I think that's a really grotesque simplification of what you're saying, Armand. But I wonder if any of the three of you would like to say a little more about this idea of relationality and reality.
Well, I was struck by, first of all, I'd give you a standing ovation, but you couldn't see it. I just was really, it was delighted with the ability to be in the presence of two folks who have just given such a succinct version of your work. So imagine that for you, Dr. Jones, I'm a teenager in upstate New York where the Klan is on the move. This is my story. And not only they're on the move, they're after all Jews, all Blacks. Did I mention that's the only one? But I knew the only Jew. And there was another view. And you're talking about Orange County, New York now, which is about an hour and a half outside New York. But the Panthers were doing what they were doing in Newburgh, New York. And that was one of my first exposures outside of volunteering in hospitals to community-based healthcare work. What we think of as now the federally qualified health systems did not exist in that extent. Even and well, you've never lived on any of what I call the Native American lands, right, Les? So, but most people aren't aware that's a whole separate system of healthcare. I had grown up in a closed system of healthcare, which was called the United States Army, where you would care from birth to death. So when you describe all of these intersections of all these different paths, because there was no history lost in the African American community about the fact that we were living on indigenous lands and that the African descent people were brought in. So I felt that all of you took all these ties through all these gray hairs and put them all in the context of today's work. So my question now, since you're in rhetoric, Les, and you also have a different path, my path is very much about how do I take social medicine into technology. Now, I understand that that's not necessarily, but I also want you to know that there's another group called the Gray Panthers. But I want to know how you perceive what can be used by this group of remarkable people to help begin to understand their power to change rhetoric, which is why I warned you what was happening in your institution to people that are not necessarily in teaching. You know, if you don't know, you can't change or co-create. And I hope that each one of us gave you the gift of co-creation. But you certainly gave me even more impetus for co-creation. Both of you, doctors. Thank you.
I think, yeah, if you can't know, you can't. Sorry, that just struck me, and I was like, I have to say something. And I think that's part of the relationality, right? You have to know what your relations are to be able to do anything with them. Sorry, Les. Or
I was just gonna sort of add to that and say that's why story is the first practice of cultural rhetorics, because we have to learn as many stories as we can and listen, and then understand the rhetorical and ethical obligation that we have in carrying those stories and using them for future knowledge and information. And so while you both are talking, I'm just sitting here. I have a lot of medical background. I don't know if I've shared this with everyone, but I worked for 10 years in the medical field before I went back to college and became a rhetorician. So I worked in trauma ERs, and I've delivered babies and all kinds of things. Anything you can imagine, I've seen it. And my mom being a nurse, I've grown around the medical field for so long. And my immediate instinct when listening to both of your keynotes is like, why don't we have community emergency care? And like, you know, like this idea of like, ooh, I'm just like picturing what an Indigenous ambulance would be like with a whole bunch of like Indigenous paramedics. Like, oh yeah, let's put, you know, these herbs on this wound while also, you know, like intubating or whatever you need to do. Like this combination of medicine, which is how I grew up, and like, right, putting these different sort of medical knowledges and technologies together in this idea of what care would look like outside of you know, these very harmful infrastructures where folks don't trust the medical field. You know, it was never a thing where I was rushed to the hospital unless you're bleeding or something's absolutely broken. My mom's like, we're just gonna take care of this at home. And so, yeah, that's what I was thinking. But you can't understand any of this and see a future unless you listen to all the stories of the past and the stories that are happening now. And something I get from my students quite frequently is like, that's so much information, it's so hard. And that's why I said this project is near impossible. There's no one story that you're going to hear that's going to give you all the answers you need. It's a constant collaboration and reassessment and commitment. And that's why constellating relationships you build, the more stories that you learn, the more knowledge we can make together. So it's you know, it's the process, and that's the beauty of it, but also the impossibility.
Yeah, kind of building off of that, I mean, my own work, I'm really interested in thinking about alternative genealogies. And I think, you know, one of the things that I really try to do is dig deep into looking at what people might say is like the traditional history and thinking about it alternatively. That's always been kind of my interest in the Black Panther Party. You know, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I grew up maybe like 2 or 3 blocks away from what used to be the Black Panther Party office in Los Angeles. And you can see this was a point of attack against, you know, any type of Black radical movement, right? This office was shot up by the police because they were giving free healthcare to people, right? Because they were creating community programs. So a part of that also involves understanding the history of communism in this country, understanding the history of socialism in this country, right? A part of, you know, some of the points that both of, you know, my keynote panelists have mentioned is this question of health at times has been very concerned with, well, that sounds socialist, right? That sounds like communism. That's terrifying, right? So like there are these questions dug inside of our histories of these terms that, you know, on their surface are oftentimes not even addressed at all. So I in my work, I'm trying to dig through all of that. That's kind of what I'm doing. Yeah.
That's in the chat. Amanda Rose Pratt, who is in a has a co-authored paper in paper discussion session 3 mentioned, unfortunately she had to run, but she mentioned something similar, Armand, that your talk made her think about the long history of the accusations of Marxism being wielded as a conservative attack on Black leaders. Yeah, so Dr. D?
Well, I guess that's what the auntie's here for, is to make you realize these are not new histories. You're talking Harry Haywood. So of course you start mentioning people that I was given in my time at your level as the people who come right before me. You're talking Paul. You're talking, and you can say this in every community, the Latinx or you can talk about so there needs to be a constant sense, I think, of identity creation, how it survives and how it functions and how we get the history. So what I am always so struck by is what was lost by the lack of the history. So I guess that's why I was so delighted with both of you. Like, yes, because the clinics that you're describing, we did in the 70s and 80s. You know, when we started some of the first HIV clinics, people would come and tell me, I'm just taking garlic and onion. And you already know where that came from. That came from all of how they were taught to do. But then I said, well, you know, we also have a virus. We have to talk about when we can use allopathic medicine and when we can use integrative and functional medicine. And we have to talk about the fusion of all healing traditions, you see? So I think that what each one of us needs to say is that we all have different healing traditions coming from our own cultures. And often we lose those stories. We lose that relevance because it hasn't been measured yet. And I think that that's crucial. A lot of what you're describing in terms of various therapies is not just on the chemical level and not just on a episode, but the transactional issue is on the energy level. And that's often not measured, especially if it comes to, I mean, otherwise, you know, women would have been allowed to continue being in charge of women's births, but it was turned off as soon as somebody was willing to pay for it. And now OBGYNs were men. So don't even really get me going on all the issues that affect the walk that many of us do in life.
Any other questions? I don't see any hand raises right now, but feel free to jump in with thoughts. Les says that this reminds them of the use of Vicks for everything in Latinx households, which, yeah. Oh, and Leah asked Armand if Leah put a link in the chat, November 18, 1970 at Boston College, if that was the Huey Newton speech that you were talking about?
No, so it's a 1971 speech. The 1970 speech is, it's a different one, but by 71 is gonna, late 70s, 71 is gonna be the development of intercommunalism.
I'm, just so everyone knows, I'm grabbing all of the various links and references that folks have been dumping in the chat and sharing, and I'll put out a reading list after the pre-conference at the end of, today. So I've made a note, so I've got the link to that one, Leah, and then I also made a note to ask you for the 1971 one, Armand. All right, Diane, I see you have a hand raised.
Hi, yes, thank you all for these invigorating talks. It's more since there weren't other questions, but I have this interesting kind of case study I'm interested in your reactions to that intersects with each of your talks. It's about a recent publication that came out, a scientific publication, I'll stick it in the chat, and it was about traditional Chinese medicine. And so the title is, Can Traditional Chinese Medicine Provide Insights into Controlling the COVID-19 Pandemic? And the argument is about the use of amulets. So it was heavily critiqued and it received a lot of Twitter traction in the scientific community, Western medicine, and it brought up a lot of issues that also I've been in related to, are there limitations to what could be promoted? I know that amulets actually get used in indigenous cultures, particularly in Mexico, and it is, and then when these publications attempt to be published in Western journals, they get critiqued. But then there's also issues of like, this intersects in different kinds of ways with people who prefer holistic medicine, prefer not to do vaccinations, prefer not to like want to wear masks. And so you get this really interesting intersection of biopolitics with other forms of different practices of medicine. I'm just interested if you have thoughts around this issue, because it's a complicated one. It's a really complicated one of how to practice biopolitics, right? So that's a kind of messy question, just given this particular case study. And if you're interested.
So this is, I'm so sorry. I didn't even let you finish.
No.
I have to really say, you have just hit the intersectionality of all the issues. And I speak as a functional medical physician who has worked within multiple communities. But the functional medical community is often not seen as having an ethnic presence, when it's always had an ethnic presence, as Les testified with her mother and with the faith healers or the folk healers that trained me and et cetera. So, but because you have these two different systems of measure, and you don't have a system that's built to measure anything in terms of research other than on a classic double-blind study. So, and then there are all these biases against whatever we know about this microcellular level. For example, in New Jersey, in southern New Jersey, they're using one entire model that looks at antioxidant levels, certain measures of vitamin B, dexamethasone, and have had tremendous results. They can't get it published, okay? So you've got to look at the bias of traditional allopathic medicine, who's in control of allopathic medicine, and the fact that they are now using that bias to arrest people for saying you should still build up your immune system by making sure you have an adequate vitamin D3 level. You should still do such and such a thing by doing antioxidants, etc. So that there is a level of repression that I think that most people are not aware of in medicine, where this battle that you're describing now between functional medicine, integrative medicine, energy medicine, and standard medicine, there's very few people in terms of who's in power, in charge of licensing, have been willing to allow an integration and an integrative use. I'm just trying to be blunt. So it's hard to measure what people can actually do because folks are just like, that's not real medicine and you're not real providers. So that's been my walking in the path.
I'd like to add to what Dr. D is saying and say, and possibly connect with Dr. Towns's work as well, and say that a lot of this also has to do, like this sort of gatekeeping of what is considered knowledge, has to do with both power, Western patriarchal dominance of what we consider medicine and viability in medicine, and also capitalism, because indigenous knowledges and medicines are all good and fine so long as a Western company can come in and extract those things and make a profit off of it within the pharmaceutical companies. But before that, it's all considered like word of mouth and hokey and whatever other terms that people use and that we're familiar with. So until it's deemed profitable, it's not legitimate. And all these corporations, right, have investment in what is published in our journals, and who gets to say what is. And then so all of those sort of things are working at the intersections there of what constitutes actual medicine and the sharing of knowledge, right? But let's look at the flip of this, where these journals, not every journal obviously, but many science journals are allowed to publish articles written by bots and robots or just false information with no validity, because they're perpetuating a narrative that makes the people who own these things more comfortable.
Armand, yeah, I was about to ask if you wanted to add something on this sort of, we're onto epistemologies now, to kind of wrap us up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, I'm pretty sure I just read something yesterday. It was like Amazon created a pharmacy or something like that. Anybody else see this? Yeah, that's terrifying, right? Like thinking about, this, especially in the middle of a pandemic, right? Where we're thinking about the delivery of a vaccine, and how is this going to be brought out, right? And who, and like you read like the stories of the vaccines, and you see like a lot of them have to be extremely cold, right? Who's going to get these vaccines? How are they going to be delivered, right? Like how are they going to be distributed? And the thinking about Amazon, we can probably gather that there's going to be very specific populations that are going to have these vaccines first, right? And they're going to disproportionately be from very specific geographic locations. And that has, history, that has a background that we can't ignore. So yeah, I'll end on that.
That's a wonderful ending point. Thank you, Armand.
Is it? It feels pretty sad.
No, I mean, what? Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Intellectually wonderful, in that it brings a lot of these threads together. And also, I want to point to Krista in the chat added a comment at the end here of, I'm wondering how all of this squares with the so-called anti-science cultural moment that we're in, that I think is a provocation, a question. I'm so glad you put it in there, Krista, to take us forward. And if I may, from my own position as a rhetorician of science, offer, I think part of the answer is what we're hearing here, which is that acting like science is one thing has actually sort of we've painted ourselves into a corner by doing that and by devaluing these other ways of knowing and being. But that is purely speculative opinion on my part, an informed opinion, but nonetheless. We are at 1:32, so I'm going to ask everyone to use an emoji or feel free to unmute so we can have like an actual bit of noise to applaud for our keynote panelists. Thank you so much. This was incredibly generative. I'm just so pleased. I want to remind everybody that I'm going to close this event space until our next session starts at 1:45. I promise there's technological reasons for doing that. But if you want to keep hanging out, you can head over to our hallway space. There's a link in the same email where you got the information about this space. And that's a spot that'll just be open throughout the remainder of the conference, and you can hang out and catch up with friends and chit chat. And, just like you would do in the hallway at a conference where you stand outside and sneak in 5 minutes late because you just couldn't break away from that conversation. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to close this room now, and I'll see you back in here at 1:45. Thank you to our keynoters. I'm just going to keep doing this until everyone's gone. Fabulous. All right. I'm going to close this out. Oh no, Carrie's coming in right now. Hi, Carrie. I saw you just joined. I'm actually about to close this room, and then I'll reopen it again for our next session.
Okay, no problem.
So it'll kick you off for like, oh, you're totally fine. It'll just kick you off for I didn't want you to be like, oh no, kick you off for 2 seconds, and then you'll be able to log right back in.
Cool, thanks for letting me know.
Sure, see you in a minute. Beverly, I'll open it right back up for us.
Okay, cool.